Hey there, and welcome to another journey into the depths of history. Tonight, we're exploring something that might just lull you into the most peaceful sleep you've had in ages. We're diving deep into the medieval world, but not the romanticized version you've seen in movies. We're talking about the real deal, the gritty, uncomfortable, and frankly terrifying reality of what life was actually like centuries ago. So get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's settle in together. We're about to discover why, despite all our modern complaints, you really wouldn't want to trade places with someone living in the year 1300. Trust me on this one. Picture this scenario for a moment. You close your eyes tonight in your comfortable bed, with your climate-controlled room, your clean sheets, and your smartphone charging nearby. But when you open them again, you're somewhere completely different. The year is 1347, and you're waking up in a small European village. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell, that overwhelming mixture of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting food, and smoke that seems to cling to everything around you. Your bed, if you can even call it that, is nothing more than a collection of straw and rags thrown onto the dirt floor of a one-room dwelling. The straw is old, probably months old, and it's become home to more creatures than just yourself. Fleas are your constant companions, along with lice, bed bugs, and various other insects that treat your body like an all-you-can-eat buffet. There's no such thing as pest control in medieval times, so you've learned to live with the constant itching and biting. The walls around you are made of whatever materials could be scrounged together. Maybe some wood, if you're fortunate, mixed with mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. This mixture, called wattle and daub, was the standard building material for common folk. It's not exactly waterproof, so when it rains, and it rains often in medieval Europe, water seeps through the walls and creates a damp, mouldy environment that would make modern health inspectors faint. There are no windows in your home, at least not in the way we think of them. Maybe there's a small opening covered with an animal hide or a piece of cloth to keep out the worst of the weather. Glass windows are a luxury reserved for the incredibly wealthy, and even then, they're small and cloudy. So your home is perpetually dim, lit only by whatever sunlight manages to squeeze through the cracks, or by the flickering flame of a candle or oil lamp when you can afford one. Privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. Your entire family, possibly including extended relatives, all share this single room. Children, parents, grandparents, maybe even a stray cousin or two, all sleeping, eating, and living in the same cramped space. Personal belongings are minimal, because there's nowhere to put them, and nothing much to own anyway. Now, let's talk about that morning routine you're so used to. You wake up and stumble toward what passes for a bathroom in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it's not pleasant. There's no indoor plumbing, no toilet paper, no running water, and definitely no privacy. Your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket kept in a corner of the room, or if you're lucky, a small outhouse behind your dwelling. The smell is indescribable, and emptying these containers is a daily chore that involves tossing the contents into the street or a nearby ditch. Speaking of the streets, they're essentially open sewers. People empty their waste buckets by simply throwing the contents out their doors or windows. There's supposed to be a warning cry, something like Gardilou, which means watch out for the water, but people don't always remember, and even when they do, there's nowhere to go to avoid the splashing filth. The streets are a mixture of mud, human waste, animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and various other unmentionable substances that create a toxic soup underfoot. Walking through town means navigating this hazardous landscape, while trying not to slip, fall, or step in something that will ruin your day even more than it already has been ruined. Your shoes, if you have any, are made of untreated leather that offers about as much protection as a paper bag. Most people go barefoot, which means your feet are constantly exposed to all manner of diseases and infections that thrive in this unsanitary environment. Let's move on to breakfast, shall we? You shuffle over to the fireplace, which is basically just an open pit in the center of your room. The smoke has nowhere to go except up through a hole in the roof, assuming there is one. So your home is perpetually filled with a thick, choking haze that makes your eyes water and your lungs burn. Chimneys exist, but they're expensive and rare. Your breakfast consists of whatever you can afford, which isn't much. If you're lucky, you might have some pottage, a thick gruel made from whatever grains, vegetables, or scraps you can find. It's been cooking in the same pot for days, maybe weeks, with new ingredients added as they become available. The result is a greyish, lumpy mixture that tastes about as appetizing as it looks. Bread is the staple of the medieval diet, but it's nothing like the fluffy loaves you're used to. Medieval bread is dense, coarse, and often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to make the grain stretch further. It's so hard that you can't bite into it directly. Instead, you have to soak it in liquid, or gnaw at it like a beaver working on a tree trunk. Water is not safe to drink. The same sources that provide your drinking water are contaminated with waste, dead animals, and various other pollutants. So instead, you drink beer or ale, even for breakfast, even as a child. These beverages are weak, with low alcohol content, but the brewing process makes them safer than water because the liquid has been boiled. This means that everyone in medieval society, from toddlers to grandparents, is slightly drunk most of the time. If you're hoping for some meat or cheese to go with your meal, you'll be disappointed unless it's a special occasion. Meat is expensive and rare for common people. You might get some on Sundays or feast days, but even then it's often spoiled or of questionable quality. There's no refrigeration, so meat preservation relies on salt, smoke, or just hoping the cool weather keeps it from rotting too quickly. Dairy products are available sometimes, but they spoil rapidly and are often contaminated with bacteria that would make you seriously ill. Fresh fruit and vegetables are only available when they're in season, and even then, they're often wormy, rotted, or contaminated. Spices that could make this bland food more palatable are incredibly expensive, worth more than gold, and reserved for the wealthy elite. After choking down your meager breakfast, it's time to get dressed for the day. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. 1. You wear the same clothes every single day for months, possibly years, until they literally fall apart. There's no washing machine, no dry cleaner, and soap is a luxury item that most people can't afford. Your clothes are made of rough, scratchy wool or coarse linen that irritates your skin constantly. The fabric is often poorly made, with seams that come apart and holes that let in the cold and rain. Underwear is optional and rare, so you're wearing these rough fabrics directly against your skin, which leads to constant chafing and rashes. The lack of washing means your clothes are stiff with accumulated dirt, sweat, and various stains. They smell terrible, but since everyone smells terrible, you don't really notice anymore. Your nose has adapted to the constant assault of unpleasant odors that surround you every day. Your shoes, if you have them, are poorly made and offer no support for your feet. They're essentially pieces of leather wrapped around your foot and tied with strips of fabric or more leather. They provide minimal protection against the rocks, thorns, and filth that cover every surface you walk on. Most people go barefoot, which means dealing with cuts, infections, and frostbite in winter. Now let's talk about personal hygiene, or rather, the complete lack thereof. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. Some people might chew on a twig or rinse their mouth with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, dental care doesn't exist. By the time you reach your 20s, your teeth are already rotting, your gums are diseased, and your breath could knock a person unconscious. Tooth pain is a constant companion for most people. There are no dentists, no pain medication, no root canals. If a tooth becomes too painful, your only option is to have it pulled out by the local barber surgeon using crude iron tools and no anesthesia. Many people die from infections that start with a simple toothache. Bathing is not only rare, it's considered dangerous. The prevailing medical wisdom of the time suggests that bathing opens your pores and allows diseases to enter your body. So most people go months or even years without washing their entire body. When they do bathe, it's often in the same water used by multiple other people, which defeats the purpose entirely. Your hair is unwashed and full of lice and other parasites. Your scalp itches constantly, and your hair is often matted and tangled. People deal with lice by picking them out by hand or by shaving their heads completely, which isn't exactly a fashionable look. Your skin is covered with a protective layer of dirt and grease that's supposed to keep you healthy, according to medieval medical theory. In reality, this layer of filth harbors bacteria and parasites that cause constant skin problems. Rashes, boils, and infections are normal parts of daily life that you just have to endure. The smell emanating from your unwashed body is overwhelming. Combined with your rotting teeth, unwashed clothes, and the general lack of sanitation around you, you exist in a cloud of stench that would be unbearable to modern sensibilities. But again, since everyone smells equally terrible, it becomes the accepted norm. This is just the beginning of your day in medieval times, and already you're dealing with conditions that would be considered inhumane by today's standards. You haven't even left your hovel yet, and you're already facing challenges that would send most modern people running back to their comfortable, climate-controlled, sanitized lives. The truly sobering part is that this isn't even the worst of it. Wait until we get to the part about medieval medicine, where the cure is often worse than the disease. Or medieval justice, where being accused of a crime means you're probably going to die regardless of whether you're actually guilty. Or the constant threat of violence, disease, and starvation that hangs over every aspect of daily life. But we'll get to all of that as we continue our journey through the harsh realities of medieval existence. For now, just imagine trying to start your day in these conditions, and remember that this was considered normal life for the vast majority of people living in Europe during the Middle Ages. It really puts our modern problems into perspective, doesn't it? Now that you've somehow managed to drag yourself through the morning routine from hell, it's time to face the medieval workplace. And let me tell you, the concept of workers' rights hadn't exactly caught on yet. In fact, the very idea would have been laughable to anyone living in 1347. If you're part of the roughly 90% of the population that works the land, congratulations, you're a serf. That's essentially a step above slavery, but not by much. You don't own the land you work, you can't leave without permission, and you owe your lord a portion of everything you produce. Think of it as the world's worst rental agreement, except you can never move out and the landlord owns you too. Your workday begins before sunrise and ends after sunset. There's no such thing as an 8-hour workday, weekend breaks, or vacation time. You work 6 days a week, and even Sunday, your supposed day of rest, is often filled with additional duties or religious obligations that are basically mandatory. The tools you're working with are primitive and poorly made. Your plough, if your lord is generous enough to provide one, is little more than a sharpened stick. Your scythe for harvesting grain is dull and constantly needs sharpening. Your hoe is wooden with maybe a small iron tip if you're incredibly fortunate. These tools break constantly, and replacing them comes out of your own meager resources. The physical labor is backbreaking in the most literal sense. You're bent over in fields for hours at a time, digging, planting, weeding, and harvesting by hand. Your spine develops a permanent curve. Your hands become gnarled claws, and every joint in your body aches constantly. By the time you reach 30, if you reach 30, you move like someone twice that age. But the worst part isn't the physical exhaustion, it's the constant uncertainty. Your entire survival depends on factors completely beyond your control. The weather, plant diseases, insect infestations, raids by neighboring lords, or simply the whims of your feudal master can mean the difference between eating and starving. If the harvest fails, which happens regularly, you don't get to call in sick or apply for unemployment benefits. You starve. Your children starve. Your elderly parents starve. There's no social safety net, no government assistance, no charitable organizations with the resources to help. When food runs out, people start dying, and it happens faster than you might think. Even when the harvest is successful, you don't get to keep most of what you produce. A significant portion goes to your lord as rent for living on his land. Another portion goes to the church as tithing, which isn't optional. What's left barely sustains you and your family through the winter months, assuming nothing goes wrong. And things go wrong constantly. Your ox might die, leaving you unable to plough your fields effectively. A late frost might kill your crops just as they're beginning to sprout. Bandits might steal your stored grain. Disease might strike your livestock. Each of these disasters pushes you closer to the edge of survival, and there's no coming back from that edge once you fall off. If you're not working in agriculture, your options aren't much better. Perhaps you're an apprentice to a craftsman, learning a trade like blacksmithing, carpentry, or weaving. The apprenticeship system means you work for years without pay, living in your master's house and learning skills through repetition and physical punishment when you make mistakes. The workshops where crafts are practiced are dark, poorly ventilated spaces filled with dangerous tools and toxic materials. Blacksmiths work with blazing forges that fill the air with smoke and sparks. Tanners work with animal hides using chemicals that burn the skin and lungs. Potters work with clay, no safety regulations, no protective equipment, and dust that slowly destroys their breathing. There are definitely no workers' compensation when things go wrong. Accidents are common and often fatal. A slip with a sharp tool, a fire that spreads too quickly, a collapse of poorly constructed scaffolding, exposure to toxic substances. These are daily risks that everyone just accepts as part of working life. If you're injured on the job, you're on your own. No one is going to support you while you recover, assuming you survived the injury in the first place. The concept of retirement doesn't exist. You work until you physically can't work anymore, and then you become a burden on your family or the community. There's no pension, no savings account, no investment portfolio to fall back on. When your body gives out, which it will relatively early due to the harsh working conditions, you hope your children can support you. If they can't, you face a slow decline into poverty and death. Women face all of these challenges plus additional burdens that make survival even more precarious. A woman's work is never finished, literally. In addition to helping with field work or craft production, women are responsible for maintaining the household, caring for children, preparing food, making and mending clothes, tending to sick family members, and managing what little resources the family has. Pregnancy and childbirth are essentially death sentences that you have to face repeatedly. There's no prenatal care, no understanding of hygiene during delivery, no pain relief, and no medical intervention when things go wrong. Many women die in childbirth, and those who survive often face complications that affect them for the rest of their lives. Infant mortality is staggeringly high, so even if you survive giving birth, there's a good chance your child won't live to see their first birthday. If you're unmarried, you're viewed with suspicion. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable to exploitation. If you're too outspoken or independent, you might be accused of witchcraft, which is essentially a death sentence. The margin for error in a woman's life is virtually non-existent. Children start working as soon as they can walk. There's no concept of childhood as a protected time for play and learning. By age 5 or 6, children are expected to contribute to the family's survival through simple tasks like gathering firewood, tending animals, or helping with household chores. Formal education is reserved for the tiny percentage of the population destined for religious life, and even then, literacy is rare. Most children don't live to adulthood. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the harsh conditions of daily life claim about half of all children before they reach their teens. Those who do survive carry the physical and emotional scars of their brutal upbringing for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll of this existence is something we can barely comprehend today. Imagine living with the constant knowledge that death is always lurking just around the corner. Not death from old age after a long, fulfilling life, but death from starvation, disease, violence, or simple bad luck. This awareness shapes every decision, every relationship, every moment of every day. There's no concept of mental health or emotional well-being. Depression, anxiety, trauma, these are just things you endure without understanding or treatment. The high rates of alcoholism in medieval society weren't just about the safety of fermented beverages. They were about people trying to numb themselves against the constant pain and fear of their daily existence. Yet somehow, people persevered. They found moments of joy in simple pleasures, formed deep bonds with family and community members, and maintained hope for a better future even when that hope seemed irrational. They developed coping mechanisms, support systems, and cultural practices that helped them survive conditions that would break most of us today. But survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was never expected. Every day was a struggle against forces far beyond individual control, and the vast majority of people lived and died in conditions that we would consider absolutely unacceptable. The idea that life gradually gets better over time, that each generation will have more opportunities than the last, simply didn't exist. If anything, people expected things to get worse, and they were often right. This is the reality that awaits you as you step outside your hovel and face another day in medieval Europe. The work that awaits you will break your body, the conditions will assault your health, and the uncertainty will wear down your spirit. Yet you'll do it anyway, because the alternative is death, and even a harsh life is better than no life at all. The harsh reality of medieval work is only made worse by the weather, which seems determined to make your miserable life even more unbearable. There's no central heating, no insulation, no weather stripping. and definitely no thermostat to adjust when things get uncomfortable. Your home is basically a wooden box with gaps everywhere that let in rain, snow, wind, and whatever else nature decides to throw at you. Winter is particularly brutal. The walls of your dwelling are thin and poorly constructed, offering about as much protection from the cold as a wet paper bag. Your windows, if they exist at all, are just holes in the wall covered with animal skins or scraps of cloth that flap uselessly in the wind. The cold seeps through every crack and crevice, turning your home into what feels like a poorly designed refrigerator. Your only source of heat is that open fire pit in the center of your room, which creates its own set of problems. The smoke fills your living space because there's nowhere else for it to go. Your eyes constantly water and burn. Your throat is perpetually raw, and everything you own is covered in a layer of soot and ash. The fire provides warmth only if you're sitting directly next to it, which means one side of your body might be warm while the other side is freezing. Keeping that fire burning requires a constant supply of wood, which isn't free. In many areas, gathering firewood from forests is illegal without permission from the local lord, and getting caught can result in severe punishment. So you're often forced to choose between staying warm and risking imprisonment, fines, or worse. Many people simply learn to live with being cold all the time. Your clothing offers little protection against the elements. That single outfit you wear every day is made from rough wool that becomes stiff and uncomfortable when wet, which is often, since there's no waterproof fabric available. When it rains, you get soaked and stay soaked until your clothes eventually dry on your body, a process that can take days and leaves you shivering and miserable. Summer brings its own set of torments. Your home becomes a sweltering oven with no ventilation and no relief from the heat. The same thick walls that fail to keep out winter cold now trap the summer heat inside, creating a stifling environment that makes it difficult to breathe. There are no fans, no air conditioning, no ice, and no way to cool down except to suffer through it. The heat makes the smells even worse. All those unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, animal waste, and general filth that surround you become even more pungent in hot weather. Flies and other insects multiply rapidly, turning your home into a buzzing nightmare of biting, crawling pests that make rest impossible. Your wool clothing becomes a torture device in summer heat. It's heavy, itchy, and traps heat against your skin, but you can't take it off because modesty requires staying covered. The fabric doesn't breathe, so you're constantly sweating into the same clothes that never get washed, creating a cycle of increasing discomfort and stench. Working in the fields during summer is particularly hellish. The sun beats down mercilessly on your unprotected head and shoulders. There's no sunscreen, no protective clothing designed for hot weather, and no scheduled breaks to escape the heat. You simply endure hour after hour of back-breaking labor, while the sun slowly cooks you alive. Dehydration is a constant threat, but safe drinking water is still scarce. You're forced to drink that weak beer or ale, even when you're desperately thirsty and overheated, which doesn't really help with hydration and sometimes makes you feel worse. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke are common, but they're just called taking ill from the sun, and there's no treatment except rest, if you can afford to rest. When storms come, and they come frequently, your poorly constructed home offers little protection. Rain pours through the thatched roof, turning your dirt floor into a muddy swamp. Wind tears at the walls and threatens to bring down the entire structure. Lightning is terrifying when you're living in a wooden building with a fire burning inside, and no understanding of electrical safety. Flooding is a regular occurrence that can destroy months of work in a matter of hours. Your crops, your stored food, your few possessions, everything can be swept away by rising water, leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back. There's no flood insurance, no disaster relief, no government assistance to help you rebuild. When nature destroys your livelihood, you start over from nothing, or you don't start over at all. The changing seasons bring different challenges but no relief. Spring means mud everywhere as the frozen ground thaws, turning roads into impassable swamps and making travel nearly impossible. Fall brings the desperate race to harvest and preserve enough food to survive the coming winter, knowing that failure means starvation before spring returns. But weather is just one of many environmental hazards you face daily. The water you're forced to drink, when you can find any, is contaminated with human waste, animal droppings, dead creatures, and various other pollutants that would horrify modern health inspectors. Rivers and streams serve as both water sources and sewage systems, creating a toxic mixture that spreads disease throughout entire communities. Every sip of water is a gamble with your life. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless other waterborne diseases are constant threats that can kill you within days of infection. You never know if that drink you just took will be your last, but you have to drink something or die of thirst, so you take the risk and hope for the best. The air you breathe is filled with smoke from countless fires, dust from dirt roads and floors, and various other particles that slowly destroy your lungs. Respiratory diseases are incredibly common, and there's no treatment except to keep breathing the same polluted air that's making you sick in the first place. Even the food you eat, when you can get it, is contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and toxins. There's no refrigeration, no food safety regulations, no way to test whether something is safe to consume. You eat what you can find and hope it doesn't kill you, knowing that malnutrition is probably going to kill you anyway if food poisoning doesn't get you first. The ground you walk on is a minefield of hazards. Broken pottery, rusty metal scraps, animal bones, human waste, rotting garbage, and sharp stones create an obstacle course that can injure you with every step. A simple cut on your foot can become infected and lead to death, but you have to keep walking because staying still means not working, and not working means not eating. Your living space is shared not just with your family, but with rats, mice, insects, and various other creatures that treat your home as their own. These animals carry diseases, contaminate your food, and compete with you for resources. There's no pest control, no way to keep them out, and no escape from their constant presence. Rats in particular are everywhere, and they're not just a nuisance. They carry fleas that spread disease. They contaminate food supplies. They damage what few possessions you have, and they reproduce so quickly that controlling their population is impossible. You learn to live with them scurrying around your feet while you eat, sleep, and try to go about your daily life. The psychological impact of living in these conditions is devastating. You're constantly stressed, always worried about the next disaster, never able to relax or feel safe. Every day brings new challenges that threaten your survival, and you never know which one might be the challenge that finally breaks you. Sleep becomes elusive when you're sharing your bed with insects, rodents, and family members in a room that's either too hot or too cold, filled with smoke, and constantly noisy with the sounds of animals, neighbors, and your own family trying to survive another night. Rest is a luxury you can't afford, but exhaustion is a constant companion that makes everything else even harder to endure. The mental toll of watching family members, friends, and neighbors die regularly from preventable causes creates a psychological landscape of grief and trauma that never heals. You learn to expect death, to accept loss as normal, and to suppress emotions that would interfere with the daily struggle to survive. Yet through all of this environmental hostility, people somehow found ways to continue living. They developed traditions, celebrations, and customs that brought brief moments of joy into their harsh existence. They formed communities that supported each other through the worst times, sharing resources and knowledge that helped everyone survive just a little bit longer. But make no mistake, the environment itself was actively hostile to human life in medieval times. Every breath, every sip, every step was potentially dangerous. The natural world wasn't something to be enjoyed or appreciated. It was something to be endured, survived, and hopefully overcome for another day. This constant battle against environmental hazards shaped every aspect of medieval life, from the foods people ate, to the clothes they wore, to the homes they built. Everything was designed around the assumption that nature was trying to kill you, because in many ways, it was. The margin for error was incredibly small, and the consequences of any mistake could be fatal. As you stand outside your hovel, breathing the polluted air and looking at the contaminated landscape around you, you begin to understand that surviving even one day in these conditions would require skills, knowledge, and physical toughness that most modern people simply don't possess. And this is still just the beginning of your medieval nightmare. But perhaps nothing illustrates the brutal reality of medieval life quite like the state of medical care. When you inevitably fall ill, and you will fall ill constantly in these conditions, you're about to discover that medieval medicine operates on principles that would be considered barbaric torture by today's standards. The medical knowledge of the time is based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval physicians, All illness stems from an imbalance of these bodily fluids. This means that regardless of what's actually wrong with you, whether it's a broken bone, a fever, or a plague boil, the treatment will likely involve trying to balance your humours through methods that are more likely to kill you than cure you. Got a headache? That's clearly too much blood in your system. Time for bloodletting, where a barber surgeon will slice open a vein and drain what they consider excess blood into a bowl. The amount they remove is determined not by medical science, which doesn't exist yet, but by how much they think you can spare before dying. Many people don't survive the cure. Feeling depressed or anxious? Obviously, you have too much black bile. The solution involves powerful laxatives made from herbs and minerals that will purge your system so violently that you'll wish you'd never complained about feeling sad. The cramping, dehydration, and potential poisoning from these treatments often create new problems far worse than the original complaint. If you're unfortunate enough to break a bone or suffer a serious wound, you're facing a nightmare of medieval surgery. There's no anesthesia except alcohol, if you can afford it, or maybe biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The surgical instruments are crude iron tools that haven't been cleaned since the last patient, assuming they were ever cleaned at all. The concept of sterilization doesn't exist because germs haven't been discovered yet. Surgeons work with dirty hands using dirty tools in dirty environments, then wonder why their patients keep dying from mysterious fevers. Infection is so common that it's considered a normal part of healing, and when gangrene sets in, the standard treatment is amputation with the same unsanitized tools. Pain management consists of herbal remedies that may or may not work, alcohol if you can get it, or simply enduring agony until you either heal or die. Opium exists, but is expensive and rare, reserved for the wealthy elite who can afford imported medicines. For everyone else, pain is just another fact of life to be endured without complaint. The physicians themselves are often more dangerous than the diseases they claim to treat. Many have no formal training beyond apprenticeship to another equally ignorant practitioner. They diagnose illnesses by examining urine colour, feeling the pulse, and consulting astrological charts to determine what the stars say about your condition. Treatment decisions are based on superstition, tradition, and guesswork, rather than any understanding of how the human body actually works. Mental illness is viewed as demonic possession or divine punishment for moral failings. Treatment involves exorcism, prayer, physical punishment, or simply locking the afflicted person away where they can't disturb others. The idea that mental health conditions might have physical causes and could be treated with compassion is completely foreign to medieval thinking. Dental problems, which everyone has due to poor diet and no oral hygiene, are handled by the same barber surgeons who do bloodletting and amputations. Tooth extraction involves crude pliers, no anesthesia, and a strong assistant to hold you down while the barber yanks infected teeth from your skull. Many people die from infections that start with dental procedures. Women face additional medical horrors related to childbirth and reproductive health. Pregnancy is managed by midwives whose knowledge comes from tradition and superstition rather than medical training. Complications during delivery often result in the death of both mother and child, since there's no understanding of proper birthing techniques or emergency interventions. Contraception is primitive and dangerous when it exists at all. Abortion attempts using herbs and crude instruments frequently result in infection, hemorrhaging, and death. Women are expected to bear children continuously throughout their reproductive years, with each pregnancy representing another roll of the dice with death. Even simple illnesses that we barely think about today can be fatal in medieval times. A cold can develop into pneumonia without treatment. A small cut can become infected and lead to blood poisoning. A stomach bug can cause dehydration severe enough to kill. There are no antibiotics, no IV fluids, no oxygen therapy, no emergency rooms staffed with trained professionals. The medicines that do exist are often more harmful than helpful. Mercury is used to treat syphilis, slowly poisoning patients while doing nothing to cure the disease. Lead-based compounds are prescribed for various ailments, causing heavy metal poisoning that creates new health problems. Arsenic is considered a cure-all that actually kills more people than it helps. Preventive medicine consists mainly of avoiding bad air called miasma, which is thought to cause disease. People carry herbs and flowers to ward off illness, wear amulets blessed by priests, and try to maintain moral purity to avoid divine punishment in the form of sickness. None of these methods are effective against actual diseases. When epidemics strike, and they strike regularly, the medical response is essentially panic, followed by desperate attempts at treatments that make everything worse. The Black Death, which kills 1/3 of Europe's population, is treated with bloodletting, purging, and burning aromatic herbs, none of which have any effect on the plague bacteria. Hospitals, where they exist, are more like hospices where people go to die rather than recover. They're run by religious orders and focus more on spiritual care than medical treatment. The sick are crowded together in unsanitary conditions that promote the spread of disease rather than healing. The life expectancy in medieval times hovers around 30 to 40 years, and that's if you survive childhood. Infant mortality is staggeringly high, with nearly half of all children dying before age 5. Women frequently die in childbirth. Men die from workplace accidents and violence. And everyone is constantly threatened by diseases that are easily treatable today. Your chances of living long enough to see your own grandchildren are slim, and your chances of aging gracefully are non-existent. By the time you reach your 30s, assuming you make it that far, your body will be broken down by hard labor, poor nutrition, and untreated medical conditions. You'll look and feel decades older than your actual age. The psychological impact of living with constant pain and illness, watching family members die regularly from preventable causes, and knowing that any day could bring a disease or injury that ends your life, creates a mindset focused entirely on survival. Long-term planning becomes impossible when you can't be sure you'll survive the next epidemic or harsh winter. Yet somehow, people continue to reproduce, to hope, to struggle against these overwhelming odds. They develop folk remedies that occasionally work through luck or placebo effect. They support each other through illness and injury as best they can with their limited resources. They find ways to endure pain and loss that would devastate modern people who are accustomed to effective medical care. But make no mistake about the reality of medieval medicine. It's not a quaint collection of herbal remedies and folk wisdom. It's a system of organized ignorance that often makes sick people sicker and turns minor problems into life-threatening emergencies. The kindest thing you can say about medieval medical care is that it occasionally doesn't kill the patient, and even that's more due to luck than skill. As you contemplate the inevitable moment when you'll need medical attention in this pre-scientific world, you begin to understand that disease and injury aren't just inconveniences to be treated and forgotten. They're potential death sentences delivered by practitioners who mean well, but lack the knowledge and tools to actually help anyone. This is the medical reality that awaits you in medieval Europe, where the cure is often worse than the disease, where pain is accepted as normal, and where death from preventable causes is so common that people plan their lives around the assumption that they won't live very long. It's a world where suffering is universal and relief is rare, where hope for healing often leads to even greater suffering. Every ache, every fever, every injury becomes a crisis that could end your life or leave you permanently disabled. There's no safety net of modern medicine to catch you when your body fails, no emergency services to rush you to treatment, no specialists who understand what's wrong and how to fix it. You're on your own with your pain, your fear, and a medical system that's more likely to hurt than heal. The truly terrifying part is that this isn't just ancient history. This was the lived reality for countless generations of human beings who suffered and died in ways that would be easily preventable today. Their pain was real, their fear was justified, and their deaths were often unnecessarily brutal, because they lived in a time before medical science had developed the knowledge and tools to actually help people heal. And speaking of things that could end your life, let's talk about food. Or more accurately, let's talk about the daily gamble of trying to eat something that won't kill you outright. You've managed to survive your morning routine, endured another day of backbreaking labor, and now you're faced with what medieval people optimistically called dinner. Food preservation in the 14th century is essentially a prayer wrapped in salt. There's no refrigeration, no freezers, no vacuum sealing, no expiration dates to guide you. Your meat, if you're fortunate enough to have any, has been hanging in the open air for days, covered with flies and slowly rotting from the inside out. The smell tells you it's probably not safe, but hunger is a more immediate threat than food poisoning, so you eat it anyway and hope for the best. Salt is worth its weight in silver, literally, so most preservation attempts rely on smoking, drying, or simply hoping the winter air keeps things fresh long enough to consume them. Your stored grain develops mold that you scrape off and ignore because throwing away food means starving. Those green patches on your bread aren't just unsightly, they're potentially deadly, but you've learned to cut around the worst parts and eat what remains. The bread that forms the foundation of your diet is nothing like the soft, fluffy loaves you might imagine. Medieval bread is dense, coarse, and often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain. Ergot poisoning causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. But it's so common that people just accept the occasional bout of madness as part of eating. Some historians believe ergot poisoning contributed to reports of witchcraft and demonic possession, as entire communities would suffer collective hallucinations after eating contaminated bread. When grain runs short, which happens regularly during bad harvest years, bakers bulk up their bread with whatever they can find. Sawdust, ground bark, clay, acorns, and even powdered bones get mixed into the flour to make it stretch further. The result is a substance that's barely edible and provides little nutrition, but it fills your stomach temporarily and gives you the illusion of having eaten something substantial. Your vegetables, when available, are often wormy and rotted. There's no pesticide to protect growing crops, no way to store fresh produce for extended periods, and no understanding of which plant diseases are dangerous to humans. You eat what you can get and pick out the worst of the insects, knowing that protein is protein, even if it's not the kind you'd prefer. Dairy products are particularly hazardous. Milk spoils within hours of being collected, and there's no pasteurization to kill the bacteria that cause tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other diseases. Cheese and butter last longer, but are often contaminated with mold and bacteria that cause severe stomach problems. Many people avoid dairy altogether, not from choice, but from bitter experience with the consequences. Meat is a luxury reserved for special occasions, and when you do get it, the quality is questionable at best. Animals are slaughtered when they're already sick or dying, because healthy livestock are too valuable to kill for food. The meat is often diseased, filled with parasites, or so old that it's beginning to decompose. There's no health inspection, no grading system, no way to ensure that what you're eating won't make you violently ill. The water situation is even more dire than the food situation. Every source of drinking water is contaminated with human waste, animal droppings, rotting organic matter, and industrial runoff from mills and tanning operations. Rivers serve as both water sources and sewage systems, creating a toxic mixture that spreads cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and countless other waterborne diseases. Wells aren't much better, since they're often located near latrines and garbage pits. The same groundwater that fills your well also carries contamination from every source of pollution in the area. Even rainwater collected in barrels becomes breeding grounds for mosquitoes and bacteria, turning your emergency water supply into another health hazard. That's why everyone drinks alcoholic beverages instead of water, even children, even first thing in the morning. The brewing process involves boiling water, which kills most bacteria and makes the resulting beer or ale safer than any other available liquid. But the alcohol content means that everyone in medieval society is slightly intoxicated most of the time, which doesn't help with making good decisions about food safety or anything else. The ale you're drinking is weak, and often contaminated with additives that aren't meant for human consumption. Brewers use whatever they can find to flavor and preserve their products, including herbs that are mildly toxic, honey that's gone bad, and fruits that are already fermenting into alcohol naturally. The result is a beverage that's safer than water, but still potentially dangerous. Spices that could make this unpalatable food more enjoyable are incredibly expensive, worth more than most people's annual income. Black pepper costs more per pound than a good horse, and exotic spices like cinnamon or nutmeg are literally worth their weight in gold. For the average person, flavor comes from whatever wild herbs you can forage, assuming you can correctly identify edible plants versus poisonous ones. Many people die from eating the wrong mushrooms, berries, or roots while desperately searching for anything to supplement their meager diet. Folk knowledge about which plants are safe varies from region to region and is often wrong, leading to accidental poisonings that kill entire families. There are no field guides, no poison control centers, no way to get accurate information about what's safe to eat. Cooking techniques are primitive and dangerous. Your open fire provides uneven heat that burns some parts of your food, while leaving other parts raw. There are no thermometers to ensure meat is cooked thoroughly enough to kill parasites and bacteria. You judge doneness by appearance and hope you're not eating something that will give you trichinosis or other meat-borne diseases. The pots and utensils you use for cooking are often contaminated with lead, which leaches into acidic foods and slowly poisons anyone who consumes meals prepared in these vessels. Lead poisoning causes mental impairment, organ damage, and death. But the connection between lead cookware and illness isn't understood, so people continue using dangerous implements without knowing they're slowly killing themselves. Food storage is a constant challenge that often fails spectacularly. Your grain gets infested with insects and rodents that contaminate everything they touch. Rats and mice leave droppings throughout your food supplies, spreading diseases like hantavirus and plague. There are no sealed containers effective enough to keep out determined pests, so you share your meals with whatever creatures manage to get into your storage areas. Even the act of eating is hazardous when you're using crude utensils with sharp edges, eating in dim lighting, and consuming food of questionable texture and content. People regularly injure themselves on poorly made knives and spoons, choke on unexpected bones or foreign objects in their food, or break teeth on bread that's hard enough to be used as building material. The psychological stress of never knowing whether your next meal might be your last meal creates a constant state of anxiety around food. You're always hungry because there's never enough to eat, always worried about whether what you're eating is safe, and always planning your next meal because you never know when you'll find food again. Malnutrition is universal among the common people, leading to stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and increased susceptibility to every disease and infection. Children who survive to adulthood are often permanently damaged by years of inadequate nutrition during their crucial developmental years. Adults lack the energy needed for hard physical labor because they're not getting enough calories or nutrients to fuel their bodies properly. Vitamin deficiencies cause diseases that are easily prevented with proper diet, but are epidemic in medieval times. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C causes teeth to fall out and wounds to never heal. Rickets from insufficient vitamin D creates deformed bones and stunted growth. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency makes it impossible to work or travel after dark. The feast and famine cycle dominates medieval life, with periods of relative abundance followed by months of starvation. When harvest time comes, people gorge themselves on whatever is available, knowing that lean times are coming. But even during harvest season, food quality is poor, and preservation methods are inadequate. So much of what's produced spoils before it can be consumed. Seasonal hunger is a regular occurrence that weakens entire populations just when they need strength most, for planting, harvesting, or surviving harsh weather. Spring is particularly difficult because stored food from the previous harvest has run out, but new crops haven't matured yet. This hungry gap claims many lives every year, as people's bodies simply give out from lack of nutrition. Social hierarchies determine who eats and who starves when food becomes scarce. The lord of the manor and his family eat well, while their serfs go hungry. Town merchants hoard grain, while rural peasants die of starvation. Even within families, food is distributed unequally, with the strongest workers getting the most, and the elderly or disabled getting whatever remains. Yet somehow, people develop traditions and customs around food that bring brief moments of joy into their harsh existence. Harvest festivals celebrate successful crops with communal feasting. Wedding banquets and funeral meals bring communities together to share whatever resources are available. Religious holidays provide excuses for special foods and temporary abundance. But these celebrations are rare bright spots in an otherwise grim reality of constant hunger, dangerous food, and contaminated water. The daily struggle to find enough calories to survive takes precedence over any concerns about nutrition, taste, or food safety. You eat what you can find, when you can find it, and hope it doesn't kill you before you can find your next meal. The irony is that people in medieval times spend most of their waking hours thinking about, searching for, producing, or consuming food, yet they're constantly malnourished and food insecure. Food dominates their lives not because they're gourmets who appreciate fine dining, but because getting enough to eat is a daily battle against starvation that many people lose. This constant preoccupation with survival leaves little mental energy for anything else. You can't plan for the future when you're not sure you'll survive the week. You can't pursue education or artistic endeavors when every moment must be devoted to finding your next meal. The search for food becomes all-consuming, limiting human potential and reducing life to its most basic elements. And just when you think the food situation couldn't get any worse, you realize that everything you've heard about medieval life so far assumes you're actually free to make choices about what to eat, where to work, and how to live. But for most people in medieval Europe, even these limited options aren't available because you don't own yourself, much less your labor or the products of that labor. Welcome to the feudal system, where your legal status is somewhere between a person and a piece of property. If you're a serf, which most people are, you belong to the land, and the land belongs to your lord. You can't leave without permission, you can't marry without approval, and you certainly can't keep the fruits of your labor for yourself. The relationship between lords and serfs is often described in romantic terms as a system of mutual obligation and protection, but the reality is much harsher. Your lord provides protection in the same way that a farmer protects his livestock, not out of benevolence, but because dead serfs don't produce crops or pay taxes. Your valuable property that must be maintained well enough to remain productive. Your lord owns your labor, your time, and your productivity. You work his land several days a week for free, in addition to working your own small plot to feed your family. During busy seasons like harvest time, you might be required to work for your lord exclusively, leaving your own crops to rot in the fields while you ensure his prosperity. The taxes you pay aren't just monetary, they're portions of everything you produce. A percentage of your grain, your livestock, your vegetables, even your labor goes to support your lord's lifestyle. These obligations are hereditary, passed down from parents to children, like a genetic curse that can never be broken. Legal justice under the feudal system is whatever your lord says it is. There are no independent courts, no jury of your peers, no appeals process. If your lord accuses you of a crime, you're guilty. If he wants your property, it becomes his property. If he decides you've offended him, your punishment is whatever amuses him at the moment. The concept of individual rights simply doesn't exist for serfs. You have no right to privacy, no right to free speech, no right to bear arms, no right to travel, no right to choose your occupation. Your rights extend only as far as your lord's benevolence, and that benevolence can be withdrawn at any time for any reason or no reason at all. Marriage requires your lord's permission because your children will also be serfs, and he wants to ensure that his property continues to reproduce itself efficiently. Love matches are discouraged in favor of unions that produce strong workers and maintain social stability. Your romantic life is just another aspect of your existence that serves your lord's interests rather than your own. Education is actively discouraged because literate serfs might develop ideas about freedom or justice that threaten the social order. Keeping people ignorant ensures their compliance and prevents them from questioning why they should spend their lives enriching someone else. Knowledge is power, and power must be carefully controlled by those who benefit from the existing system. Religious instruction focuses heavily on accepting your station in life as God's will and finding virtue in suffering and obedience. The Church, which owns vast amounts of land and numerous serfs, has a vested interest in promoting a theology that justifies inequality and discourages rebellion. Priests preach that earthly suffering will be rewarded in heaven, but only if you accept your fate without complaint. The psychological impact of being owned by another human being shapes every aspect of personality and behavior. You learn to suppress your own desires and opinions in favor of whatever pleases your superiors. Initiative and creativity are discouraged because they might lead to inconvenient questions about why things have to be this way. Children grow up knowing that their lives are not their own, that their dreams and ambitions matter less than their ability to produce wealth for their owners. This learned helplessness becomes so ingrained that many serfs can't imagine any other way of living, even when opportunities for freedom occasionally arise. The few serfs who do manage to escape their bondage often find that freedom brings its own set of challenges. Without land, connections, or capital, free peasants often live in even worse poverty than serfs. At least serfs have guaranteed access to land and some protection from their lords. Free peasants have independence, but no security. Yet the desire for freedom burns in many hearts despite the risks and hardships it might bring. Some serfs run away to cities where they might disappear into the anonymous urban population. Others save money for years to buy their freedom, though the price is usually set so high that few can afford it. A lucky few earn freedom through exceptional service, or by catching their lord in a generous mood. But for the vast majority, Serfdom is a lifetime sentence that extends to their children and their children's children. The system is designed to perpetuate itself through generations, creating a stable source of labor for the landowning class while ensuring that working people never accumulate enough resources to challenge the existing order. The feudal system creates a society where birth determines destiny more than talent, effort, or character. If you're born a serf, you'll die a serf, regardless of your intelligence, creativity, or ambition. Social mobility is virtually non-existent, and the idea that anyone can improve their station through hard work is not just false but dangerous to those who benefit from cheap labor. This rigid social hierarchy is enforced not just through law but through culture, religion, and social pressure. Everyone learns their place and stays in it, not just because they're forced to, but because they're taught that stepping out of line is immoral, unnatural, and offensive to God. The system becomes self-enforcing as people police themselves and each other. The economic inefficiency of feudalism means that society as a whole remains poor and underdeveloped. When most people have no incentive to innovate or increase productivity beyond basic survival, technological and social progress stagnates. The wealth that does exist is concentrated among a tiny elite, while the vast majority live in conditions that barely qualify as human. Yet this system persists for centuries because it serves the interests of those with power, while keeping everyone else too busy surviving to organize effective resistance. Change comes slowly and often violently, as the contradictions within feudalism eventually become unsustainable, and new forms of social organization begin to emerge. But for now, in your medieval existence, feudalism is simply the way things are, and have always been. You accept your bondage not because you choose to, but because you have no choice, no alternative, and no hope that things could ever be different. Your life belongs to someone else, and that someone else has very little interest in your happiness, your health, or your humanity. This is the social reality that underlies all the other hardships of medieval life. The hunger, the disease, the violence, the ignorance, all of these are made worse by a system that treats most human beings as disposable resources rather than individuals worthy of dignity and respect. You're not just fighting against nature and disease and poverty, you're fighting against a social system designed to keep you powerless and desperate. The crushing weight of feudal bondage is just one layer of control in a system designed to extract every ounce of value from your existence. But even beyond the economic exploitation lies something perhaps even more suffocating: the complete absence of personal freedom in ways that extend far beyond your relationship with your lord. Let's talk about movement, or rather, the complete lack of it. In our modern world, you can wake up tomorrow and decide to drive to another state, book a flight to another country, or simply walk down the street without asking anyone's permission. In medieval times, that kind of mobility is not just discouraged, it's illegal. You are bound to the land, which means you are bound to a specific geographical location for your entire life. If you're caught more than a few miles from your home without written permission from your lord, you're considered a runaway serf. The punishment for this crime can range from public flogging to having your feet cut off to prevent future escape attempts. Your movement is monitored by neighbors, traveling merchants, and local officials who all have incentives to report suspicious travelers. There's a whole network of people whose job it is to make sure you stay exactly where you belong. This geographical imprisonment means that you will likely never see anything beyond a tiny radius around your birthplace. The farthest you might travel in your entire lifetime is to the nearest market town, perhaps 10 or 15 miles away, and even that requires permission and a legitimate reason for the journey. The world beyond your immediate surroundings might as well be another planet for all the access you have to it. Your social interactions are equally restricted. You can't choose your friends freely, because associating with the wrong people can be seen as seditious or disloyal. Your conversations are monitored, your opinions are policed, and expressing dissatisfaction with your circumstances can result in severe punishment. The concept of free speech doesn't exist when every word you utter might be reported to authorities who have absolute power over your life. Marriage, as mentioned, requires permission, but the restrictions go much deeper than simple approval. Your lord has the right to choose your spouse based on what serves his interests best. Maybe he wants to strengthen his workforce by pairing strong workers. Maybe he wants to reward a loyal serf with a desirable partner. Maybe he just enjoys exercising his power over the most intimate aspects of your life. Your feelings, preferences, and compatibility with your assigned partner are irrelevant considerations. Once married, you can't divorce without permission, which is almost never granted. You're stuck with whatever spouse was chosen for you, regardless of abuse, incompatibility, or simple mutual hatred that might develop over time. Domestic violence is not only legal, but expected as a way for husbands to maintain proper discipline over their wives and children. The authorities won't intervene in family disputes unless they threaten productivity or public order. Your children belong to your Lord almost as much as they belong to you. He decides whether they can receive any education, what trade they might learn, whom they will marry, and where they will live. If he needs workers for a distant property, he can separate families by moving children away from their parents. The emotional bonds between family members are secondary to economic efficiency and social control. Religion provides no escape from this suffocating control, because the church is fully integrated into the feudal system. The local priest is appointed by your Lord and preaches sermons that reinforce obedience and acceptance of your station. Religious doctrine is twisted to support the social hierarchy, with countless references to the virtue of submission and the sin of pride or ambition. Even your relationship with God is mediated through authorities who benefit from your continued servitude. The few holidays and festivals that break up the monotony of daily labor are carefully controlled events designed to release just enough social pressure to prevent outright rebellion. These celebrations allow for temporary reversals of social order, with peasants mocking their betters and engaging in behavior that would normally be punished. But these safety valves are calculated concessions that ultimately strengthen the system by providing the illusion of freedom while changing nothing fundamental about power relationships. Even death doesn't free you from these restrictions. Your burial location, the ceremonies performed, and the disposition of whatever meager possessions you might have accumulated are all subject to your Lord's approval. Your family can't even mourn you in their own way, if it conflicts with social expectations or religious requirements imposed from above. The psychological damage inflicted by this total lack of autonomy creates a learned helplessness that persists across generations. People become so accustomed to having every aspect of their lives controlled by others that they lose the ability to make independent decisions, even when opportunities arise. The mental muscles required for self-direction atrophy from disuse, leaving individuals unable to function without external control and guidance. This conditioning begins in early childhood and is reinforced through every social interaction. Children learn that their opinions don't matter, their desires are irrelevant, and their primary purpose is to serve others. They internalize these lessons so thoroughly that questioning authority becomes literally unthinkable. The system creates its own psychological prison that's often stronger than physical constraints. The rare individuals who do maintain some spark of independence or critical thinking are quickly identified and either crushed into compliance or eliminated as threats to social stability. There's no tolerance for nonconformity, no space for individual expression, and no patience for anyone who doesn't accept their assigned role without question. Creativity and innovation are viewed with suspicion because they suggest dissatisfaction with existing arrangements. The cumulative effect of these restrictions is a society where human potential is systematically wasted on a massive scale. Brilliant minds that might have made great discoveries spend their lives mucking out stables. Artistic talents that could have created beautiful works are channeled into repetitive manual labor. Leadership abilities that could have improved communities are suppressed in favor of blind obedience to incompetent authorities. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this system is how it makes people complicit in their own oppression. Serfs police each other, reporting suspicious behavior and enforcing conformity within their own ranks. Parents teach their children to accept subjugation as natural and inevitable. Communities ostracize anyone who questions the established order, even when that order keeps everyone in poverty and misery. The isolation created by restricted movement compounds these problems by preventing people from comparing their situations with alternatives. You can't know that life could be different if you've never seen how people live elsewhere. The authorities work hard to maintain this ignorance, because knowledge of alternatives might inspire dangerous ideas about change and improvement. Information flows in only one direction, from the top down, and that information is carefully filtered to support existing power structures. News from distant places is rare and unreliable. Education that might provide broader perspectives is actively suppressed. Even stories and songs are monitored to ensure they don't contain subversive messages about freedom or justice. This creates a closed system where challenges to authority can't develop because the intellectual tools needed to formulate such challenges are systematically denied to the population. People remain trapped not just by physical constraints, but by mental ones that are even more difficult to escape. The prison is built inside their own minds through years of conditioning and isolation. The few who do manage to break free from these mental shackles often find themselves completely alone in their understanding. They can see the injustice and inefficiency of the system, but they can't communicate their insights to others who lack the conceptual framework to understand what freedom might look like. These isolated dissidents either go mad from the contradiction between their understanding and their circumstances, or they learn to hide their knowledge and live double lives. Even when popular uprisings do occur, they're usually led by people from outside the serf class who have retained some capacity for independent thought. The serfs themselves rarely initiate resistance because they've been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their circumstances as natural and unchangeable. When they do join rebellions, it's often more from desperation than from any coherent vision of alternative social arrangements. The system's stability comes from this perfect integration of physical, economic, social, and psychological control mechanisms. Each reinforces the others to create a web of oppression that's nearly impossible to escape. Even if you could somehow overcome one form of constraint, you'd still be trapped by all the others. Freedom requires breaking multiple chains simultaneously, which is almost impossible when you're struggling just to survive from day to day. Yet despite all these mechanisms of control, the human spirit occasionally finds ways to assert itself. Small acts of defiance, quiet moments of dignity, secret expressions of love and creativity occur even under the most oppressive circumstances. These tiny sparks of humanity don't change the system, but they remind us that something essential persists, even when everything else has been stripped away. People find ways to create meaning and connection within the narrow confines allowed to them. They develop subtle forms of resistance that fly under the radar of authority. They preserve stories and traditions that maintain alternative values and perspectives. They form underground networks of mutual support that help each other survive the worst excesses of the system. But these small victories come at enormous cost and provide little comfort when measured against the vast waste of human potential that characterizes medieval society. For every person who manages to maintain some measure of inner freedom, thousands more are crushed into complete submission. For every act of quiet resistance, millions of acts of compliance reinforce the existing order. The tragedy is that this system persists not because it works well, but because it serves the interests of a tiny elite, while keeping everyone else too powerized and desperate to organize effective opposition. The wealth and power concentrated at the top come directly from the poverty and powerlessness imposed on everyone below. It's a zero-sum game where the winners can only win by ensuring that everyone else loses. And here's perhaps the most disturbing realization about your life in medieval times. Everything we've discussed so far assumes that you're actually allowed to live. Because in a world where human life has so little value, where violence is the primary mechanism for resolving disputes, and where justice is whatever those in power decide it should be, your continued existence is never guaranteed. Let's examine the reality of medieval justice, which bears no resemblance to anything we would recognize as fair or rational today. The legal system, if you can call it that, is designed not to determine truth or ensure fairness, but to maintain social order and reinforce existing power structures. Justice isn't blind in medieval times. It's completely corrupted by wealth, status, and political connections. If you're accused of a crime, and accusations can come from anyone for any reason, your guilt or innocence is determined not by evidence or testimony, but by your social position relative to your accuser. If a noble accuses a serf of theft, the serf is automatically guilty regardless of the facts. If two serfs accuse each other, the one with better connections to local authorities usually wins. The concept of presumed innocence doesn't exist when your social status determines your credibility. The methods used to determine guilt would be considered torture by modern standards, because that's exactly what they are. Trial by ordeal involves subjecting the accused to physical tests that are supposedly judged by God. You might be forced to carry red-hot iron bars in your bare hands, with guilt or innocence determined by how quickly the burns heal. You might be thrown into water while bound, with sinking proving innocence and floating proving guilt, which creates the perverse situation where drowning is the best possible outcome. Another popular method is trial by combat, where the accused fights either the accuser or a professional champion. The theory is that God will ensure the innocent party wins, which means that physical strength and fighting skill are considered more reliable indicators of moral character than evidence or witness testimony. If you're elderly, disabled, or simply not trained in combat, you're essentially guaranteed to lose regardless of whether you committed any crime. The punishments for convicted criminals are designed to be as public and brutal as possible, serving as entertainment for the masses while deterring others from similar behavior. Public executions draw crowds like modern sporting events, with people traveling from miles away to watch criminals be hanged, beheaded, burned alive, or torn apart by wild animals. Children are brought to these spectacles as educational experiences about the consequences of defying authority. Lesser crimes result in punishments that are designed to permanently mark the offender and make their shame visible to everyone. Thieves might have their hands cut off, liars might have their tongues removed, adulterers might be branded on their foreheads. These mutilations serve as lifelong advertisements of past transgressions, ensuring that the punished person can never fully reintegrate into society or escape their criminal history. The stocks and pillories provide opportunities for community participation in punishment, allowing ordinary citizens to throw rotten food, stones, or human waste at helpless criminals while they're restrained in public squares. This collective violence reinforces social bonds while allowing people to vent their frustrations on approved targets rather than questioning the system that oppresses them all. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval justice is how arbitrary and capricious it can be. Laws change based on the whims of whoever happens to be in power. Behaviors that were legal yesterday might be capital offenses today. Actions that are ignored when committed by the wealthy result in death sentences when performed by the poor. There's no consistency, no predictability, and no appeal process when things go wrong. Local authorities have essentially unlimited power to define crimes and punishments as they see fit. A lord who's in a bad mood might decide that looking at him the wrong way constitutes treason. A sheriff who's having financial difficulties might suddenly discover that half the people in his jurisdiction are guilty of tax evasion. Justice becomes a tool for personal enrichment and political control, rather than any kind of principled system for maintaining order. The concept of proportional punishment doesn't exist when the primary goal is intimidation, rather than rehabilitation or restitution. Minor offences routinely result in death sentences because killing criminals is cheaper than imprisoning them, and more effective at terrorizing the population into compliance. The value of human life is so low that execution is considered an appropriate response to stealing food, trespassing, or speaking disrespectfully to social superiors. Women face additional layers of legal discrimination that make them even more vulnerable to arbitrary punishment. They can't testify against men in most circumstances, can't own property independently, and can't make legal contracts without male supervision. Any woman who behaves in ways that threaten male authority can be accused of witchcraft, which carries an automatic death sentence and requires no evidence beyond the testimony of her accusers. The witch trials that periodically sweep through medieval communities serve multiple functions beyond their stated purpose of eliminating supernatural threats. They provide convenient ways to eliminate inconvenient women, settle personal grudges, and demonstrate the power of religious and secular authorities. Any woman who's too independent, too knowledgeable, too outspoken, or simply too attractive can find herself facing accusations that are impossible to disprove and inevitably result in torture and execution. Children have essentially no legal protections and can be punished as severely as adults for similar offences. Parents have unlimited authority to discipline their children through violence, and community members are expected to participate in correcting any child who steps out of line. Child labour is not just legal but mandatory, and children who refuse to work or who work inadequately can face the same brutal punishments as adult criminals. The legal system also serves as a mechanism for social control by creating categories of people who exist outside legal protection entirely. Outlaws, declared criminals who fled justice, can be killed by anyone without legal consequences. This status can be imposed for relatively minor offences, creating a class of people who must live as hunted animals in forests and wastelands, preying on travelers and settlements to survive. The combination of arbitrary laws, brutal punishments, and corrupt enforcement creates an atmosphere of constant terror, where everyone lives in fear of accidentally breaking unknown rules or falling victim to false accusations. This fear serves the interests of those in power by making people desperate to avoid any behavior that might be construed as rebellious or disruptive. Self-censorship becomes so thorough that most people police their own thoughts as carefully as their actions. Yet even this reign of terror isn't applied equally across society. The wealthy and powerful can literally get away with murder, while the poor face execution for stealing bread. Noble criminals might receive gentle house arrest or token fines, while peasant criminals face torture and death for identical offences. Justice isn't just blind to wealth and status. It's actively corrupted by these factors in ways that make a mockery of any pretense of fairness. The psychological impact of living under such a system creates a population that's traumatized, suspicious, and prone to violence themselves. When brutal punishment is the norm, and human life has little value, people internalize these attitudes and apply them to their own relationships and conflicts. Domestic violence, child abuse, and community conflicts all escalate more quickly and resolve more violently when society models these behaviors through its official institutions. This creates a vicious cycle where violence breeds more violence, fear breeds more fear, and injustice breeds more injustice. The legal system, instead of creating order and stability, actually increases chaos and suffering by teaching people that might makes right, and that the strong can do whatever they want to the weak without consequences. The few attempts at legal reform that occur during medieval times are usually motivated not by concerns about justice or human rights, but by practical considerations about maintaining order and maximizing tax revenue. Dead criminals can't pay taxes, and communities in constant turmoil are less productive than peaceful ones. But these reforms are limited and temporary, easily reversed when political circumstances change or when new authorities take power with different priorities. Even the Church, which might be expected to provide some moral restraint on secular violence, actively participates in and encourages brutal punishment for crimes against religious authority. Heretics, blasphemers, and anyone who questions church doctrine face punishments that are often worse than those imposed for murder or theft. The Inquisition develops torture techniques that are considered innovative advances in the technology of inflicting pain and extracting confessions. The result is a legal environment where your safety depends entirely on avoiding the attention of authorities and hoping that you never find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time when someone needs a scapegoat for their problems. There's no protection for the innocent, no recourse for the wrongly accused, and no hope for justice when the system itself is fundamentally unjust. This is the legal reality that hangs over every aspect of your medieval existence, like a sword suspended by a thread that could break at any moment. Every interaction with authority figures is potentially your last. Every neighbor could become your accuser. Every day could be the day when arbitrary violence destroys everything you've worked to build, and everyone you care about. The knowledge that you live completely at the mercy of people who have no mercy shapes every decision you make and every relationship you form. You learn to be invisible, to avoid standing out in any way, to never give anyone a reason to notice you or remember your name. Because in medieval times, being noticed by the wrong people isn't just dangerous, it's often fatal. And with that constant threat of sudden, violent death hanging over your head like a storm cloud that never breaks, you begin to understand that everything else we've discussed about medieval life, the hunger, the disease, the backbreaking labor, the social oppression, all of it exists within this larger context of institutionalized violence and systematic brutality that makes every day a gamble with your life. Living under this perpetual threat of violence, you might think the church would offer some sanctuary, some respite from the brutality of daily existence. After all, isn't religion supposed to provide comfort, guidance, and moral authority? Well, prepare yourself for another harsh awakening, because medieval Christianity isn't the gentle, forgiving faith you might expect. It's a rigid system of control that penetrates every aspect of your existence and makes your already miserable life even more constrained. Let's start with the most basic requirement: attendance at Mass. This isn't optional. Missing church services is considered a sin that can result in public punishment, fines you can't afford, or social ostracism that makes survival even more difficult. You're expected to attend not just on Sundays, but on dozens of holy days throughout the year, regardless of whether you're sick, injured, or desperately needed elsewhere. To prevent your crops from rotting, the church service itself is conducted entirely in Latin, a language you don't understand and aren't allowed to learn. The priest faces away from the congregation while mumbling incomprehensible words, so you spend hours standing in a cold, drafty building, listening to sounds that might as well be magical incantations. You're not encouraged to think about the meaning or ask questions. Your job is to show up, shut up, and demonstrate proper reverence for mysteries you're not supposed to understand. The tithing system requires you to give 10% of everything you produce to the church, regardless of how little you have or how desperately your family needs those resources. This isn't calculated based on your profits or surplus, but on your gross production. If you grow 10 bushels of grain, 1 bushel goes to the church even if your family is starving. If you have 10 chickens, 1 chicken belongs to God's representatives even if the other 9 aren't enough to feed your children. But tithing is just the beginning of the church's financial demands. There are special collections for building repairs, fees for performing sacraments like baptisms and marriages, payments required for blessing your home or livestock, and countless other opportunities for the clergy to extract money from people who have none to spare. Every major life event becomes a transaction that enriches the church while impoverishing you further. The moral code imposed by medieval Christianity is impossibly strict and contradictory, designed to ensure that everyone is always guilty of something. You're supposed to be humble but not lazy, generous but not wasteful, obedient but not passive. Every natural human impulse is classified as sinful, from sexual desire to anger to pride in your work. Even feeling happy about good fortune is considered the sin of pride, while feeling sad about misfortune shows lack of faith in God's plan. The concept of original sin means you're born guilty and remain guilty no matter how hard you try to live righteously. Every child enters the world already deserving eternal damnation, and only through constant submission to church authority and repeated payments for forgiveness can you hope to avoid an eternity of torture after death. This creates a psychological burden that starts in infancy and never lifts, poisoning every moment of existence with fear and guilt. Confession requires you to regularly humiliate yourself by admitting your sins to the local priest, who then assigns punishments that might include fasting, physical self-harm, public penance, or additional payments to the church. The priest, who's supposed to keep your confession secret, often uses this information to monitor and control community members. Your most private thoughts and struggles become tools for manipulation and social control. The church's obsession with sexual purity creates particularly harsh restrictions on natural human behavior. Marriage is considered a necessary evil for controlling lust, but sexual pleasure, even within marriage, is viewed with suspicion. Women are blamed for tempting men into sin through their mere existence, which means they face constant scrutiny and judgment about their clothing, behavior, and interactions with others. Celibacy is officially required for priests, though this rule is widely ignored by clergy who maintain unofficial families while preaching about the sinfulness of sexual desire. This hypocrisy extends throughout the church hierarchy, where officials who live in luxury preach about the virtue of poverty, and men who've never done physical labor lecture peasants about the dignity of hard work. The church's teachings about the afterlife are designed to maximize fear and compliance rather than provide comfort or hope. Hell is described in vivid, terrifying detail as a place of eternal torture, where unrepentant sinners suffer unimaginable agony forever. Heaven is portrayed as a distant possibility, available only to those who perfectly follow church doctrine and completely submit to religious authority. Most people are taught to expect purgatory, a middle ground where souls suffer for centuries or millennia to purify themselves of sins. These afterlife beliefs create a culture of terror, where death isn't seen as a natural transition, but as a judgment that could result in eternal torment. People spend their entire lives in fear of making mistakes that could damn their souls forever, which makes them easier to control and more willing to sacrifice their earthly well-being for the promise of spiritual salvation. The church also maintains strict control over information and education, ensuring that alternative viewpoints never reach the general population. The Bible is kept in Latin and chained to church altars where only clergy can access it. Teaching people to read is discouraged because literacy might lead to dangerous independent thinking. Books that contradict church doctrine are burned, and anyone caught possessing forbidden knowledge faces charges of heresy. This information control extends to scientific and medical knowledge that might compete with religious explanations for natural phenomena. The Church teaches that disease is caused by sin, that natural disasters are divine punishment, and that human suffering is part of God's plan that shouldn't be questioned or alleviated through human effort. This attitude actively prevents the development of knowledge that could improve people's lives. Women face particularly harsh treatment under medieval Christianity, which teaches that they're inherently inferior to men and responsible for bringing sin into the world. Women can't become priests, can't own church property, and can't participate in religious decision-making. They're expected to remain silent in church, cover their heads to hide their shameful hair, and submit completely to male authority in all matters. The Church's attitude toward women creates a culture where domestic violence is not just tolerated, but encouraged as a way for husbands to maintain proper Christian discipline over their wives. Women who resist male authority, speak too boldly, or show too much independence are accused of being influenced by Satan and face severe punishment including imprisonment, torture, or execution. Children are taught from birth that questioning religious authority is the worst possible sin, worse than murder or theft. They're indoctrinated with stories designed to terrorize them into compliance, tales of children who disobeyed their parents being dragged to hell by demons, or young people who asked too many questions being struck down by divine wrath. Critical thinking is portrayed as dangerous pride that leads to damnation. The church calendar dominates daily life with a complex schedule of fast days, feast days, holy days, and periods of penance that dictate what you can eat, when you can work, and how you should behave throughout the year. Lent requires 40 days of fasting and self-denial when you're already malnourished. Advent demands solemn preparation when you're struggling to find enough firewood to survive winter. Holy days prohibit work when your crops desperately need attention. These religious restrictions often conflict with practical necessities, creating impossible choices between spiritual requirements and physical survival. Do you attend lengthy church services while your grain rots in the fields? Do you fast during Lent when you're already starving? Do you spend your last coins on church fees when your children need food? The Church's answer is always that spiritual concerns take precedence over earthly needs, even when earthly needs include staying alive. The clergy themselves live in stark contrast to the poverty and self-denial they preach to others. Bishops and abbots inhabit luxurious palaces, eat elaborate meals, and accumulate vast wealth while their parishioners struggle to survive. Parish priests may live more modestly, but they still enjoy privileges and protections that ordinary people lack, including education, steady income, and exemption from the physical labor that breaks everyone else's bodies. This hypocrisy is justified through complex theological arguments about the clergy's special relationship with God and their need to maintain dignity befitting their sacred roles. The obvious contradiction between preaching poverty while practicing wealth is explained away as necessary for the Church's mission, though that mission seems to focus more on accumulating power than helping the suffering masses. The Church's political power rivals that of secular authorities, creating another layer of control over people's lives. Bishops and abbots function as feudal lords with their own armies, courts, and territories. They participate in wars, make political alliances, and pursue wealth and power with the same ruthlessness as any secular ruler. The difference is that they claim divine authority for their actions, making resistance not just rebellious, but blasphemous. Religious courts have jurisdiction over moral offences, marriage disputes, and anything involving church property or personnel. These courts operate under different rules than secular ones, often with even less regard for evidence or fairness. Being tried in a church court means facing judges who consider themselves representatives of God and who view any challenge to their authority as an attack on divine order itself. The Inquisition represents the Church's systematic effort to root out and destroy anyone who threatens religious orthodoxy. Heretics, which can include anyone who asks inconvenient questions or holds unauthorized opinions, face imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Inquisition's methods are so brutal that they make secular justice look merciful by comparison, and their reach is so extensive that no one is safe from suspicion and persecution. Even death doesn't free you from the church's control and financial demands. Proper burial in consecrated ground requires payment to the church, and families often go into debt to ensure their loved ones receive Christian funerals. Without church approval, bodies are buried in unhallowed ground, which according to doctrine means the souls can never reach heaven. This creates another form of extortion, where grieving families must choose between poverty and eternal damnation for their deceased relatives. The saints who are supposed to intercede for common people are often noble or wealthy individuals whose sainthood was purchased through large donations to the church. The miracles attributed to these saints typically involve helping the wealthy and powerful rather than relieving the suffering of ordinary people. Even in the spiritual realm, social hierarchy determines who receives divine favor and who remains abandoned by heaven. Prayer itself becomes another form of labor that's expected but rarely rewarded. People spend hours daily on their knees reciting prayers they don't understand, hoping for divine intervention that never comes. When prayers aren't answered, the failure is blamed on the petitioner's lack of faith or hidden sins, rather than on the ineffectiveness of the system itself. The Church's promise of reward in heaven for earthly suffering serves as a powerful tool for maintaining social stability by encouraging people to accept their miserable conditions rather than trying to improve them. Revolution becomes not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damaging, since it shows lack of faith in God's plan and trust in divine justice. This religious justification for inequality and oppression makes the feudal system seem not just inevitable but morally correct. Yet despite all these oppressive aspects of medieval Christianity, people cling to their faith because it's literally the only hope they have for meaning and purpose in lives that are otherwise defined entirely by suffering and survival. The Church may exploit and control them, but it also provides the only explanation for why their lives have value and the only promise that their pain might eventually lead to something better. The tragedy is that this hope, however slim and conditional, makes people complicit in their own oppression by preventing them from seeking earthly solutions to earthly problems. Instead of organizing to improve their conditions, they pray for patience to endure them. Instead of challenging unjust authorities, they submit to them as part of God's will. Instead of demanding better treatment, they accept abuse as a test of their faith. This religious framework transforms every aspect of medieval life into a spiritual battleground where earthly comfort is viewed with suspicion and earthly suffering is seen as potentially beneficial. The result is a society that not only tolerates massive inequality and widespread misery, but actually sanctifies these conditions as necessary for spiritual development and divine purpose. And so you find yourself trapped not just by economic, social, and political forces, but by a religious system that tells you this entrapment is exactly where God wants you to be. Your suffering isn't just inevitable, it's holy. Your poverty isn't just unfortunate, it's virtuous. Your powerlessness isn't just political, it's spiritual. The Church has taken your misery and transformed it into a sacrament, making resistance not just dangerous, but sinful. In this suffocating atmosphere of religious control, where even your thoughts are monitored for signs of heresy, and your most private moments are subject to clerical scrutiny, you begin to understand that medieval life isn't just physically brutal, it's spiritually crushing, in ways that make escape seem not just impossible, but morally wrong. The combination of earthly suffering and religious guilt creates a psychological prison that's even more effective than physical chains. You're not just afraid of starving or freezing, or being beaten to death by your Lord's soldiers. You're afraid that trying to avoid these fates might damn your eternal soul. The Church has weaponized your own survival instinct against you, making self-preservation into a form of spiritual suicide. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval Christianity. It takes people who are already suffering beyond modern comprehension and convinces them that this suffering is not only deserved, but beneficial. It transforms victims into willing participants in their own victimization by promising them that their pain in this life will be rewarded with bliss in the next, while making sure that this bliss remains forever out of reach for anyone who dares to question the system that creates such pain in the first place. And just when you think you've grasped the full scope of medieval misery, when you believe you understand how thoroughly the systems of feudalism, brutal labor, primitive medicine, contaminated food, and oppressive religion have conspired to make human existence as difficult as possible, you discover that we haven't even discussed what might be the worst aspect of medieval life: the complete and utter lack of any hope that things could ever get better. In our modern world, we take for granted the idea of progress, the assumption that each generation will have more opportunities than the last, that technology and knowledge will continue advancing, that social problems can be solved through human effort and ingenuity. This optimistic worldview, so fundamental to how we think about life and plan for the future, simply doesn't exist in medieval times. Instead, the prevailing belief is that the world is in a state of constant decline from a golden age in the distant past. People believe they're living in the final age of the world, that things will continue getting worse until the apocalypse arrives to end human history entirely. This isn't just a religious belief, though it's reinforced by church doctrine. It's a practical observation based on the lived experience of generations who have watched conditions deteriorate and seen no evidence that human effort can create lasting improvements. The technological stagnation of medieval Europe means that the same primitive tools and techniques are used century after century with little innovation or advancement. Your great-grandfather ploughed his fields with the same kind of wooden implement that you use, and your great-grandchildren will use identical tools because no one expects anything better to be invented. The idea that humans could develop new technologies to make life easier or more productive is so foreign that it's literally unthinkable. Social mobility, the possibility of improving your station in life through talent, hard work, or good fortune, is so rare as to be virtually non-existent. The social position you're born into is the social position you'll die in, and your children will inherit the same limitations and restrictions that define your existence. There are no success stories of peasants becoming merchants, no tales of serfs earning their freedom through exceptional service, no examples of anyone climbing out of poverty through their own efforts. The economic system is designed to prevent accumulation of wealth or resources by common people, ensuring that any temporary improvements in your circumstances are quickly eliminated by taxes, fees, bad weather, disease, or simple bad luck. Even if you manage to save a little grain or earn a few extra coins, these small gains are so precarious and easily lost that they provide no foundation for building a better life for yourself or your family. Education, which might offer a path to advancement, or at least a broader understanding of the world, is actively discouraged and practically unavailable. The few schools that exist are controlled by the church and reserved for boys destined for religious careers. The idea that ordinary people might benefit from learning to read, write, or understand mathematics is considered dangerous to social stability and contrary to God's plan for humanity. The isolation created by restricted movement means that you never see examples of different ways of organizing society or living life. You can't compare your circumstances with alternatives because you have no knowledge of alternatives. The way things are in your small corner of the world is the only way you can imagine them being anywhere. This ignorance isn't accidental. It's carefully maintained by authorities who benefit from people believing that current arrangements are natural and inevitable. Even the stories and songs that might inspire hope for change are carefully controlled to reinforce existing power structures. The tales you hear celebrate nobles who overcome great challenges through divine favor and superior breeding, not common people who improve their circumstances through their own efforts. The moral of every story is that good things happen to good people who know their place and accept their station, while bad things happen to those who reach above their designated roles. The medical knowledge that might alleviate some suffering remains primitive and often counterproductive, with no indication that better treatments will ever be developed. People die from the same diseases that killed their ancestors, in the same ways, with the same ineffective remedies. The idea that human understanding of health and healing could advance through study and experimentation is foreign to a worldview that attributes all illness to divine will or moral failing. Natural disasters, crop failures, epidemics, and wars are viewed as inevitable recurring events rather than problems that might be solved or prevented through human planning and effort. Famines are expected to happen periodically, plagues are accepted as divine punishment that must be endured, and conflicts between rulers are seen as natural expressions of human nature rather than political problems that could be addressed through better governance. The cyclical nature of medieval life, with the same seasonal patterns of planting and harvesting, the same religious calendar of fasts and feasts, the same social rituals of birth, marriage, and death, creates a sense that time moves in circles rather than forward progress. Each year resembles the last. Each generation faces the same challenges as the previous one, and the future holds nothing but repetition of familiar patterns of struggle and survival. This absence of hope for improvement has profound psychological effects that compound all the other hardships of medieval existence. When you believe that suffering is permanent and inevitable, you don't develop the coping mechanisms and resilience strategies that depend on expecting better times ahead. When you can't envision a future different from the present, you can't make long-term plans or investments in improvement. When you have no examples of successful change, you don't develop the skills and knowledge needed to create change yourself. The mental energy that might go toward innovation, planning, or social organization instead gets channeled into simple survival and acceptance of unchangeable circumstances. People become passive in the face of problems that might be solvable because they've never seen problems being solved through human effort. They endure rather than resist, because resistance seems pointless when the fundamental structures of society appear to be permanent fixtures of reality itself. This learned helplessness becomes so deeply ingrained that even when opportunities for improvement do arise, people often can't recognize them or take advantage of them. The mental habits formed by generations of powerlessness persist even when circumstances change, creating a cultural inertia that maintains oppressive conditions long after the forces that originally created them have weakened. The absence of hope also affects relationships and community bonds in ways that make collective action difficult. When everyone expects life to remain miserable, people focus on competing for scarce resources rather than cooperating to create more resources. Trust becomes harder to maintain when everyone is desperate, and when helping others means having less for yourself and your family. Social solidarity breaks down under the pressure of constant scarcity and mutual suspicion. Yet perhaps most tragically, this hopelessness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that prevents the very changes that might make life better. When no one believes improvement is possible, no one tries to create improvement. When everyone accepts current conditions as permanent, those conditions become more difficult to change. The absence of hope doesn't just reflect reality, it helps create and maintain that reality by discouraging efforts to transform it. The few individuals who do maintain some optimism or vision of alternatives are often viewed with suspicion or hostility by their communities. People who suggest that life could be different are seen as dangerous dreamers who might attract unwanted attention from authorities or who might inspire others to take risks that could make everyone's situation worse. Hope itself becomes a form of deviance that threatens social stability. This creates a culture where the greatest virtue is stoic acceptance of whatever hardships life brings, where questioning existing arrangements is seen as foolish pride, and where any attempt to improve conditions is viewed as dangerous rebellion against the natural order. The result is a society that remains trapped in patterns of suffering not just because change is difficult, but because the possibility of change has been systematically eliminated from people's mental frameworks. And so you find yourself living not just in physical poverty and social oppression, but in a kind of spiritual poverty that's even more devastating. The poverty of imagination, the inability to envision any future different from the brutal present. You're trapped not just by external circumstances, but by the death of hope itself, by a worldview that has transformed suffering from a problem to be solved into a permanent condition to be endured. This hopelessness colors every aspect of your daily existence, making each hardship seem not just painful but pointless. The hunger isn't just uncomfortable, it's a permanent feature of life that will never be eliminated. The disease isn't just dangerous, it's an inevitable part of human existence that will always claim its victims. The oppression isn't just unfair, it's the natural order that can never be changed. In this context, the simple act of surviving another day becomes not an achievement to be proud of, but merely a postponement of inevitable suffering. Tomorrow will bring the same struggles as today. Next year will repeat this year's hardships, and the next generation will inherit the same misery that defines your existence. There is no light at the end of the tunnel because there is no tunnel, only an endless cave of darkness that stretches from birth to death without variation or relief. This is perhaps the most alien aspect of medieval life for modern minds to comprehend, the complete absence of the future as a concept worth considering or planning for. In a world where progress is impossible and hope is dangerous, where every day is focused entirely on immediate survival, and where long-term thinking extends only to storing enough grain to last until next harvest, the very idea of building something better for future generations becomes literally meaningless. And with that crushing weight of hopelessness pressing down on every moment of your existence, you begin to understand why medieval people developed such an intense focus on the afterlife. When this world offers nothing but suffering with no possibility of improvement, when every day brings fresh misery, and every tomorrow promises more of the same, the only hope that remains is the hope for escape through death into whatever lies beyond this veil of tears. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this hopeless existence is how it affects the most vulnerable members of society, the children. In our modern world, childhood is viewed as a protected time of innocence, play, and gradual development. In medieval times, childhood is simply a brief period of smaller-size suffering before graduating to full adult misery. Children begin working as soon as they can walk steadily, usually around age 4 or 5. There are no child labor laws, no compulsory education, no concept of protecting young minds from the harsh realities of survival. A 5-year-old might be responsible for tending geese, gathering firewood, or helping with harvest work. By age 7, they're expected to contribute meaningfully to family survival through tasks that would be considered abuse by modern standards. The mortality rate among children is staggering. Roughly half of all children die before reaching their 5th birthday, victims of malnutrition, disease, accidents, or simple exposure to the elements. Parents learn not to become too attached to their young children because the odds of losing them are so high. Naming ceremonies are sometimes delayed until a child survives their first winter, and family planning revolves around the assumption that several children will need to be born to ensure 1 or 2 survive to adulthood. Those children who do survive face a daily existence that would traumatize modern adults. They witness violence, death, and suffering as routine parts of life. They see animals slaughtered for food, neighbors die from disease, criminals executed in public squares. They learn early that life is brutal, unfair, and often short. The psychological impact of this constant exposure to trauma creates adults who are emotionally numbed, suspicious of others, and focused entirely on immediate survival rather than long-term planning or emotional connections. Education for common children consists mainly of learning how to work harder and complain less. Boys might learn their father's trade through observation and imitation, while girls learn household management, childcare, and the various forms of submission expected from women. Reading and writing are skills reserved for the tiny percentage of children destined for religious life, and even then, literacy is limited to Latin religious texts, rather than practical knowledge that might improve daily life. Play, when it occurs at all, consists of activities that prepare children for adult work or that help them process the violence and death they witness regularly. Children play at being soldiers, farmers, or executioners. Their games involve mock battles, pretend funerals, or competitions that test skills they'll need for survival. There are no toys as we understand them, no books written specifically for children, no entertainment designed to delight young minds or encourage creativity. The transition from childhood to adulthood happens abruptly, often around age 12 or 13 when children are considered old enough to take on full adult responsibilities. There's no adolescence, no gradual introduction to adult concerns, no time for identity formation or exploration of interests. One day you're a child doing child-sized work. The next day you're an adult expected to perform at adult levels with adult consequences for failure. Marriage for girls often begins as soon as they reach physical maturity, sometimes even before. 12-year-old brides are common, and the wedding night represents not a romantic culmination of courtship, but the beginning of a life defined by pregnancy, childbirth, and domestic servitude. These child brides face the same risks of death in childbirth as adult women, but with bodies that aren't fully developed, and immune systems weakened by years of malnutrition. Boys face different but equally harsh transitions to adulthood. They might be apprenticed to craftsmen, where they'll work without pay for years while learning trades that will break their bodies by middle age. Or they might be pressed into military service where they'll face violent death in conflicts they don't understand for causes that don't benefit them. The lucky ones inherit their father's farm and the opportunity to struggle with the same problems that killed their ancestors. The relationship between parents and children is necessarily distant and practical, rather than emotional and nurturing. Parents can't afford to coddle children who need to develop toughness and resilience quickly. Discipline is harsh and often violent, not from cruelty but from the understanding that children who don't learn obedience and hard work early will not survive long in adult society. Love exists, but it's expressed through teaching survival skills rather than through affection or emotional support. Children learn early that their lives belong not to themselves, but to their families, their lords, and their God. Personal desires, individual talents, and unique interests are luxuries that can't be afforded when every day requires focusing on basic survival. Children who show creativity or intelligence learn to hide these traits because standing out in any way can be dangerous in a society that values conformity and submission above all else. The few children who do receive education beyond basic survival skills are usually destined for religious life, which means giving up any possibility of marriage, family, or personal autonomy in exchange for literacy and relative security. Even these privileged children face lives of strict discipline, limited freedom, and complete submission to religious authority. Education comes at the cost of nearly every other aspect of human experience. So there you have it. A single day in medieval times, from that first breath of contaminated air to the final prayer whispered in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of suffering and the smells of decay. You've witnessed a world where hope was a luxury, where progress was impossible, and where every sunrise brought nothing but the promise of more misery. Perhaps now, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, with your modern conveniences and your endless possibilities, you'll appreciate just how far we've come from those brutal centuries when simply surviving until tomorrow was humanity's greatest achievement.